Hi, it's Simone Ferris, and we're coming into week 4 in our book review for our different chapters out of The Myth of the American Superhero by William Erdmans Lawrence and John Shelton and Robert Jewett. Today we're going to talk about the chapter 9, Cheerful Saints and Melodious Lions. What an interesting chapter this is. The main idea of the chapter is to understand the art of filmmaking using mythology to help define how the American monomyth was transferred while under a code ban, kind of a form of restriction for filmmakers at the Motion Picture American Association of America. The irony of the code is that the people in the colony of the filmmakers were known as Sodom of the Sea, and were forced to follow a code restriction instead of representing values that they did not believe in. The chapter also describes how Walt Disney saw the world in his own eyes, an example of what he thought the world would be, also suggested in his film called Fantasia, where there were the small mermaids and this small world. He had this fascination with the small world. He also created that small troops in the Disneyland, and in the Disneyland Enterprises later on. The chapter describes how easy it was for Walt Disney, though, to create such timeless films within the confinements of the code, while being a great cultural influence by using myths. To break down the summary of this chapter, the writers of the book tap into some reading or some research within the anthropologist Hortense Powdermakers in her observations over about 50 years ago. She went to stay in the film colony and evaluated some of the morals and artifacts during for about a year between 1947 and 48. She was told about this code and was unaware of that code, and really thought it was pretty hypocritical of the people that lived in the colony that they would be writing about beliefs that they really didn't believe in. This veteran anthropologist, though, never considered Walt Disney, although he was one of the greatest popular creators and contributors to the MPAA, who learned how to operate with code. Because of his decency and artistic merit, it was easy for him to follow those guidelines. Beginning in the first subheading, the Code of Sanitation in Disneyland, it describes how Walt creates the characters with some type of mythic appeal. The chapter mentions one of his greatest achievements. It's his first sexless character, Mickey Mouse. The chapter mentions how the cartoon was released, and how this mouse had visited him in the garage and came to be kind of like a savior. He was kind of there when Walt would be working, and he created this character almost as if they needed the mouse in the situation of a crisis, because compared to the story with Walt and the mouse visiting him and how he created this mouse of a savior, it was kind of a friend of his. This can also be compared, though, when we think about superhero activity or superhero myths, can be related to what our reading in The Dark Knight Batman Returns. Both use animals as a superhero, and they both are used as a savior. When times get hard, they call on this savior to help them. The correlation of the stories describing these two animals as saviors is interesting, and how popular they become amongst human society. The chapter mentions also about his Walt Disney's first cartoon released in 1932 called The Flowers and Trees, in which he received an Academy Award for. very for his ingenious presentation. The next heading in the chapter was the discussion of Disney's creation of the Super Mouse and the influence that it had on the mythic development. Was called the Axle Decade for the American monomyth. Again, what an interesting correlation between the two, the Mickey Mouse and the flower and trees presentations, and how he used that to tell the stories. The next chapter the next subheading that we don't want to leave out was the Mary Poppins Heidi touch, which proved to be one of the greatest financial successes for Disney mentioned by these writers and seemed to be proof that action films were more profitable. The next heading was Disney's beautification of violence, which describes the explorational evaluation of how Disney handled violence in his films by keeping happiness at the top of his cardinal rule, in creating animated violence in his universe. And then the chapter goes into discussion of the creation of Disneyland and world of figures associated with diffused violence that could be enjoyed without the after effect per the reading. In the next heading, the moralization of nature and war, Disney shows his understanding of how skillfully he's able to simplify the moralization of nature and war. He describes this in the film Sleeping Beauty, and even more so showing the mythic patterns that were shown in animation while helping to sanitize the violence in the film. When discussing American culture, you can't leave out the next title, that's the next subheading, titled The Cultural Supremacy of Walt Disney. Walt Disney won the highest civilian award, the Medal of Freedom, and that's what this next section talks about, and in the chapter how Disney's techniques held power in his mythic artifacts above all other entertainment. It basically described how incredible Walt Disney was in his sense of miraculousness, to say the least. The remarkableness of his sanitation. The Center of Mythic Artifacts is described as one of the greatest films, which is Lion King. It's a primary example, and part of the reading provides a model for human interaction that sanctifies domination and violence. But ultimately, Walt Disney's mission was to bring happiness to millions through his myth making. Almost to the end of the chapter in the reading, The Restoration of Beastly Dynasty, it discusses after Walt Disney's death. It posed an interesting question as to would Disney Corporation still be able to comply to the mythic tradition of the American monomyth. When reviewing that, the dynasty changes seem to happen when Disney Enterprises obtained the Touchstone Pictures. And so there was a change after Walt Disney had passed away in order to keep up with the new considered filmmaking and myth-telling. Disney was always known for the theme of nature's natural domination. So under the heading, next to the last heading, Other Disney Kingdoms, is describing the films of the 1990s, films with that shows natural patriarchal power, that have characters that fit into that code per se. And so they're again showing Walt's his insistence on following the guidelines and just being a decent person, wanting the world to look, wanting people to see the world in a different way. And with a global attraction, with a global attraction, in the last heading of the chapter, it's not surprising, asking the question, is Disney a democratic educator? Walt Disney always seemed to be moralizing the world and being a great storyteller that learned how to be innovatively unique and present appropriate visual images with humor suitable for children. Disney Enterprises has become a public educator with democratic values by default, but to this day refuses to acknowledge any political views, only mythical views. So that is the chapter in the summary, some of the main idea and how that ties into American culture monomyth. Thank you.